The European Union governments and the EU Parliament have reached a deal on targets for the supply of critical minerals, including rare earths, to reduce its reliance on third countries, primarily China. Now, the Critical Raw Materials Act could come into effect as early as next year, after being proposed by the European Commission in March. The Strategic Raw Materials deal puts targets on local extraction, recycling, and processing of some 16 critical minerals and rare earths that are key for chip and EV battery production. Among its goals, extracting 10% of the bloc's annual needs locally. Let's take a closer look at one category of critical minerals, rare earths. China is the EU's largest partner for imports of the rare earth elements, accounting for 40% of the total weight of imports in 2022, and followed by Malaysia with 31% and Russia with 25% of the total rare earth imports into the EU last year. Reinhilde Veugelers is a senior fellow with the independent think tank Bruegel. She joins me now for more on this. Reinhilde, welcome to the show. Europe is one of the world's biggest markets for electric vehicles, yet the continent produces less than 1% of minerals like lithium and cobalt. How realistic, then, is this target that we're seeing of, in this case, 10% extraction of minerals?
But the question also is how important is it to have critical access to these materials here? What's most important is that we can access our components at the most efficient and effective way here. And of course, if there would be a critical dependence that would block that access to the best and most effective and fair prices, these kind of materials, that's what really the key bottleneck. So it's not necessarily that we need to have 10% locally produced at home. I don't think that's a really relevant KPI to look at here. What really matters is, can we assure a continuous access to the best critical materials at the best prices here? And that requires sufficient diversification here, but not necessarily local production, because if that local production means that we will be only able to supply locally at less efficient and at higher costs here, that may come at a high cost also. So for me, what's a relevant KPI is how can we assure the best possible conditions to access the critical components that we need for our production locally here. But that's not necessarily local production.
But these targets are at the same time really focused on local production in part and local refining. Is that not true? That is the focus here. Are you saying that that's maybe not the correct focus?
Yes, because policymakers very often think that the way in order to assure this access to is by local production, but that's not necessarily the case here. So that really depends also on how efficient and effective we can assure this local production here. Also how, and this relative to what we can obtain on world markets here. So in that respect, it's really, we need to take a way broader look at this and see to which extent we can actually also supply these critical materials at best conditions by having a much more diversified supply of these here on a global scale here, diversified with suppliers that can actually also offer these opportunities at very efficient conditions as well.
If the demand for these minerals is...
We also need to avoid... we also need to avoid that we become dependent on local production then as well. Local production that would not necessarily be the most efficient one here and could also capture us in certain conditions that don't allow for that flexibility of supply as well. So it's not the right KPI to look at. The KPI to look at is really how flexible can we get access to the critical materials
but
here.
The assertion here, if I may, the assertion here is that local production will begin to be cost efficient because demand is so high that prices around the world will rise. Are you saying that that's not likely to happen in the near future, that it's still going to be more expensive to extract, refine, and put into battery components here in Europe compared to elsewhere?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm not saying that that's not possible here, but it all depends on. So it's really a critical condition here. If local production is something that will always be at a constant disadvantage relative to what can be obtained globally here, then we will never be able to develop this as a long-term viable option here. But that's not to say that in certain areas we could actually do this here. So that's for me also the most important thing to look at is so which kind of activities can we really develop locally where we can do this in a sustainable fashion in the longer term here, such that we would have also in the longer term, compared to what what others in the world can actually realize in those sectors here, we do have a consistent comparative advantage here. And I do think that's possible here if we would also use more our innovative potential here. So that means that we should not necessarily always be focusing on the current critical materials for the current technologies that are being used here, but also look at what would be the next generation of products and what kind of critical materials could we develop as components for the next generation of technologies here, and then in innovation technologies here where we can have a comparative advantage here. Not necessarily.
If I may, how important are these minerals? Maybe you can put it into perspective for us. How important are these minerals for this key goal of making more mobility electric? Maybe you can help us understand that in terms of how critical is it that these minerals remain at an affordable level, or also on the other side, that they are extracted more locally or are accessible, I should say.
Yeah, so as part of electric vehicles, the battery, of course, is a very important component. And in battery, they're very important critical materials. But again, and as already said, there are various vintages of batteries here. So currently, lithium is a very important one here. But we are also working already on next generation batteries where lithium will be can be replaced by other critical materials here. Sometimes maybe also more synthetic materials as well here. So I think we also need to diversify in terms of different kind of technologies that we will be able to use for electric vehicles and for batteries here, such that we can build much better resilience, not necessarily by local production of one particular critical material of one technology here, but have also diversified in terms of different technologies for the components, like for batteries as well here. So in that respect, it will always be critical, but then depending on the fact that we have diversified different technologies, we can also diversify our dependencies on particular critical materials as well here.
Right.
But not individual materials, by diversifying our technologies.
And we'll have to leave it there. That's Reinhilde Veugelers with Bruegel. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.